The sun rises one morning, and two people awake, each in a different area of the same city, strangers to one another. But both are readying themselves for the day's High Holy Day service. The first, a spiritual leader. A spiritual leader in the community prepares to support others in experiencing the rituals of the holiday, and is filled with joy and anticipation of the long and meaningful days ahead. The other, a relatively new member, is getting ready to go to temple for the very first time, and is filled with anticipation of what the day's experience will be. The high holidays feel weighty this year to the new member who has something they've been waiting to say to God. And this day, one of the holiest of the entire year, feels like the best chance to share a prayer that has so far gone unanswered. Now, each of these two individuals arrives at the temple early. The leader is greeted warmly by familiar faces, those who return year after year, and the service begins. The temple is filled with the buzz and the energy of the joyous community as family members and friends find each other and participate in the service without hesitation. But despite arriving promptly and having anticipated this day for weeks, the new member holds back, not yet comfortable in this new place, working on finding the courage to join in and speak aloud the prayer that has been waiting to be shared. The service leader notices this new attendee and approaches them during a quiet moment between the multiple services of the day. Welcome. Tell me your story. Walk with me to the next service I'm about to start. We can get to know each other a bit. And here, in a moment of surprising bravery, the new member shares what has been waiting to be said, in a voice that's more clear than expected, being the first words spoken that day. The words, the paragraphs that have been floating around inside this new member's head, waiting to be shared, come out in a sudden cascade, like a waterfall that has been blocked until this moment. And somehow, as the service leader listens to this story, both individuals notice a spark of something lighting up the space between them. A feeling that something sacred is being shared, and for a moment, they both seem to feel God's presence in the temple around them. The exchange leaves both of them in tears, and as they each join in the next service, other community members around them wonder, what has shifted in this space? What words were spoken? What was so meaningful about this encounter? This story from the Talmud takes place over 2,000 years ago, when the high holidays were observed at the ancient temple in Jerusalem. Israelites would embark on a pilgrimage to make an offering to God, and the ritual steps of these offerings were facilitated by the Kohen Gadol, the high priest. Now, we don't really know what was said or what words, if any, might have been exchanged between those making the offering and the Kohen Gadol. Yet in this Talmudic story, we learn of one encounter when a conversation takes place between the two at the entrance to the temple, just before the high priest enters the Holy of Holies. And our sages tell us that whatever is shared leaves both of them crying. And the story, it leaves me with so many questions. What was the nature of their conversation? Were these tears filled with joy and gladness, or fear and sadness? Why doesn't the Talmud share what was spoken? Why is it so important that immediately from this conversation, God's presence is felt? As Rabbi Goldstein reminded us last night, we humans are chemically wired to connect. Our biology links us, you see, opens us and expands our capacity to share life together. When we are trusted or shown kindness in action or in response to a story shared or heard, oxytocin and dopamine are released, which deepens our ability to be together in meaningful ways. Of course, it does this by enhancing our sense of empathy. and our ability to experience others' emotions. When I tell a personal story, like the one I opened our service with, whether over coffee, with a friend, or within a sermon, I make myself vulnerable. And I offer a point of connection with others who may feel more encouraged to share some of their own stories. Perhaps you can recall a story from your own life's narrative that, when shared, served as a bonding moment with a stranger, started a new friendship, or deepened an existing relationship. So often, sharing a story is an entry point, an opening to a conversation. Because when we share, we bring our narrative into the world, one that has the potential to connect and resonate deeply, as well as offer understanding and a practice for cultivating compassion. The biggest takeaway for me in sharing stories about myself has been that vulnerability creates space for both self-reflection as well as true connection. Parker Palmer, an author and teacher of education, leadership, and spirituality, writes in his book, Let My Life Speak, "Before you tell your life what you meant to do with it, listen for what it intends to do with you. Before you tell your life what truths and values you have decided to live up to, let your life tell you what truths you embody and what values you represent." So what happens when we give voice to our stories, our real, true, authentic stories, ones that help us find our truth? A year ago, on Rosh Hashanah, I stood on this bima and asked you to say Hineni, to say, "Here I am," ready to engage in life in our sacred community. And on Yom Kippur, I asked you to share your name, and you have done so in so many ways. So this morning, on this Rosh Hashanah, I want to explore why we have a moral and spiritual need and social imperative to engage with our own voices and our own authentic stories and discover ways to share them. It is through our sharing our story with others that we learn who we really are. When we share our stories, we, in that moment, determine what we highlight and what we lift up. In this sharing, through the vulnerability of opening up, we give voice to the truths within. And we build trust with others as we engage in mutual sharing and listening. And not only do we deepen connections with others, but also ourselves, because our stories allow us to make sense of the world and better understand who we are and how we live within it. We know the world needs a whole lot more of this. It's what this community is all about, showing up for each other and building relationships through the stories we share. Through these connections and openings for relationship, we also get to know God. And in these moments between the narratives and connections of two people, that we can find the space where God dwells. You see, I believe that the lessons, adventures, and narratives of our lives are our own personal Torah. And when we share them, we engage with a certain kind of learning. Our tradition teaches us that God dwells between two people engaged in the study of Torah. Regardless of our theological belief, then, when we share stories, we connect with others and have the capacity to bring forth a divine presence into this world. And we do this by cultivating a vulnerability and sharing. Vulnerability, of course, brings us closer. It breaks down barriers. It allows us to navigate the pathways towards our central truths. A conversation with vulnerability might even allow us to ask ourselves if the path we are on is ours or that of the society in which we live. As a rabbi, I have the privilege to be a holder of stories. Stories that inspire, stories full of pain, of trauma and grief, of hopes and dreams, and stories of the most magnificent joys in life. And I believe the synagogue is an extraordinary convener of our stories. What if in the year to come, We as a community committed to truly sharing our story with each other? What if when we walk into this space and we say, "How are you?" we actually take the moment to share what is going on in our lives? What if we see each person in our community as someone who has the capacity to listen, to know, and to lift up? Or what if when we learn something in a class, are inspired by a B'nai Mitzvah teaching, or hear a story while packing lunches for Project Nourish, we see those moments as a deepening connection and chance to engage, ask questions, or have a thoughtful dialogue? Certainly listening to others' stories can be as transformative as sharing our own. 300 years ago, the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement, the first modern reforming revolution of our tradition, attempted to engage in a radical experiment in Jewish connectivity. As a storyteller, he sought to convey the wisdom of our tradition in the tales and lives of people just like you and me. He saw the value in the experience of the people, not just the rabbis of old. He realized that when we share our stories, we build connections and encourage our sacred purpose by drawing near to something greater than ourselves. In his book, Hasidic Tales, Rabbi Rami Shapiro writes that the Baal Shem Tov taught that every word you overhear, no matter how seemingly inconsequential, is in fact spoken for your ears alone. Every moment, life presents you with another opportunity to look within yourself and see where you can improve the quality of your thought, word, and deed. Do not imagine that the world revolves around you. It doesn't. But know that whatever is in the world is in you as well. Let reality be your Rebbe, your teacher. Our stories, the truths within them, can teach us, guide us, and others as well. And yet, being vulnerable and sharing our unique stories can be uncomfortable and sometimes even scary. It can be challenging to find the courage to share, and it can be difficult to speak hard truths. Sometimes it's anxiety-provoking to look within ourselves and notice thoughts or feelings that we may not expect and to articulate them aloud. As we consider how we might step forward and share, we have a communal obligation and social imperative to create spaces for sharing, where our words and stories are received as our truth and not used against us. Authenticity comes from acknowledging, like Palmer does, that my life is not only about my strengths and virtues, it is also about my liabilities and my limits, my trespasses and my shadow. An inevitable, though often ignored, dimension of the quest of wholeness is that we must embrace what we dislike or find shameful about ourselves, as well as what we are confident and proud of. And I include myself in this imperative. I too am human, a spouse, a dad, trying to manage and juggle the complexities of living every day. And when I embrace vulnerability in my interactions, I too seek authentic connection. In 5784, BJBE is going to engage in lifting up the multifaceted, diverse, unique stories of our community and create a spiritual practice of listening to others. We will give voice to our narratives, break down barriers, and create accessible and compelling spaces to share. Whether it be guest speakers on the Bima on Shabbat using film or books to discuss our own lives, exploring all the languages in our newly updated creative art studio, a new intergenerational story corps, or just making the time to talk and listen to one another as we spend time in the Village Center. This is not bound to age. We share stories in the Chava Center and the JLC and Symposium and everywhere in between. We each have stories to tell and things to learn from one another in the way in which we show up and listen. This is how we connect and build community. For we are a storytelling people. When we share our stories, each of our unique voices joins to create a woven tapestry, like a talit that when spread over us is a source of comfort and strength. Imagine if we practice this narrative sharing as a way to deepen compassion and understanding. How might this practice help us outside these walls as we counter civil discourse and polarization around us? How then might these encounters change through the practice that we have cultivated? How might sharing our story be part of the building blocks to build a world of wholeness? BJBE is a place that wants to know what makes you, you. What are the parts of yourself that seek connections with others? What stories will you tell from your own journey? And what parts of those stories will you focus on? How will you share? How will your story invoke tears of connection and bring forth God's presence in our world? This is our work, and I hope that you will join me. Stories remind us that we are not alone in this world. And we, just like those from 2,000 years ago, never quite know how our words and stories will touch the lives of others. These stories give voice to the sacred connection we know will help shape the world for the better. May 5784 be a year of sharing and listening, one joining with another and another and another, as all of us lift up the sacred and holy through the connections we make and the stories we share. Shana Tova.
This is the sound of one voice, one spirit, one voice, the sound of one who makes a choice. This is the sound of one voice. This is the sound of one voice. This is the sound of voices too, the sound of me singing with you, helping each other to make it through. This is the sound of voices too. This is the sound of voices too. This is the sound of voices three, singing together in harmony, surrendering to the mystery. This is the sound of voices three. This is the sound of voices three. This is the sound of all of us, singing with love and the will to trust. Leave the rest behind, it'll turn to dust. This is the sound of all of us. This is the sound of all of us. Ooh. This is the sound of one.